topic of my keynote and the keynote for the conference presentation would be how North Korean hackers are working with Eastern European cyber criminals. My name is Vitali Kremez. My also Twitter handle is VKIntel, and I'm going to dive deeper into the intersection between some of the offensive capabilities we developed to look into some of the nation-state groups and what their arsenal, how they target us, and also look at the cybercrime groups that are financially motivated. And what are some of the interesting intersections across them too? So let's start from there. Actually, this is one of the reports we published earlier. It was actually, the report was probably one of the biggest discoveries of 2019, 2020. It's that time when we finally found the technical evidence behind the North Korean hackers working closely with one specific sophisticated Russian or Eastern European cybercrime group. And we'll dive deeper into the intersection, what it means, and we'll show actually specific toolkits that that we'll use to look for that. So the agenda of the talk would be covering what the unique things and what are unique aspects of the underground and cybercrime world we've seen as the past years or two. What's the evolution? What's next future we would see across both the groups that target us and how we can defend across that spectrum. We'll also talk about the specific group called TrickBot and their project called Anchor. We'll talk about what they're trying to achieve and what the massive machinery behind their operation, how it works, and how they specifically introduced one unique product called Anchor. Anchor was the fork of the malware itself, of the TrickBot core itself, so it contains unique functionality, but it matured and actually evolved more into high-value target tool. Specific tool used only to target the most interesting and sophisticated targets, such as big financial institutions, government networks, etc. Also, we'll talk about what the unique aspects about the world itself. We'll talk about the kind of uniting the ununitable. So the Crimeware meets APT, Advanced Persistent Threat Groups. No longer we can treat the world as it's, the groups are, financially motivated groups are not connected at all to nation-state groups, as we've seen with different operations in the world, and of course through like different espionage groups. But we've seen the unique intersections, and the unique intersection was across the group we call Lazarus, which is a North Korean linked nation-state sponsored group, which tasked to collect currency and bring back to the North Korean budget. And we'll talk about the TrickBot group and the Crimeware groups that are linked to that. And those groups are, of course, financially motivated at first, but they are also working together now. They're just kind of like the unique discovery across the spectrum. We'll talk about what it means, the deadly planeswalker, and what the unique aspects of the cybercrime world. And we'll introduce you some of the unique aspects. What are the unique ways how we can use in for future and of course for current to run very efficient and long-standing YARA rules. So we'll dive deeper into that. So my name is Vitali Kremez. I'm also a well-known ethical hacker. Some of my research has been published before many times in the press, oftentimes on my own blog, vkremez.com. You can take a look, feel free. One of the unique aspects of I guess myself itself, I worked previously in the US government, tracking some of the most sophisticated groups. Oftentimes my name actually appears in some malware. One of the unique aspects, I guess, the Russian state group called APT 28 included my name in the properties of one of the binary files, signing with that. So my name is pretty popular in the malware community, but also I'm also an executive and a strategic advisor itself. So feel free to follow me on Twitter too. Like you try to share some of the technical evidence, some technical links across the malware samples to try to help mitigate and protect against cyber threats. This is me. So what are the cybercrime trends of 2020, and what do we see in the world of attacks and who target us from both? One of the unique aspects about the conference itself, which attracts me so much and touches my heart, is that's the connections between the defensive and offensive aspects of our mind. I definitely believe that to be a great defender, you need to be a great hacker. There's no way around this. And to be a great develop great malware protections, you need to develop really great malware capabilities itself. So there's a very interconnected mind. So, and I think in my view, in the world as we see from the colleagues and essentially the company that I run, it's that we would believe that by studying cyber criminals and what they do, it allows us to have predictive value. So we can know and how to both defend, and we can also know what the tools they can be used in the future against us. So we'll talk about the cybercrime trends of 2020. It's that the sophisticated criminal enterprises, TrickBot, QuackBot, and of course TA505, are currently focused on parsing high-value targets. What they do is the botnets, as you might be familiar with those are very notorious big botnets, are currently used to for additional like loading purposes, and of course targeting as well. So they're very active. They're relying predominantly via spam, email spam intrusions or attacks or spam campaigns. They also have a plethora of affiliates they work with, but what they do is they're no longer interested in regular targets. That's less value to extract, but they highly focus and develop tooling around the parsing and identifying high-value targets, HVT. And that's where the cybercrime meets APT, as we've seen with the ransomware approach. That's where the flavor of the day is the ransomware is the most profitable venture currently, even across the cybercrime world, where some of the most sophisticated groups realize that they already have essentially access to the entry of the house, so they can use the groups of exploitation affiliates to deploy ransomware, and this kind of becomes very targeted and very APT-like advanced persistent threat group. I've also seen that the ransom hacks used to amplify extortion, where they use the social media as well. But also the big botnet data collectors, they need scalable solutions to identify high-value targets, including corporate networks, such as corporate networks with local domains, and of course, to filter out disinfections that are not corporate or governments who do not have, like, for example, Active Directory trees. And the idea is pretty simple, has always been and still is. It's just to squeeze more pounds, euros, and dollars value from your bots as much as possible. So the key, what they've been deploying is the banking malware. It's the key. Of course, credential stealing malware is still used, miner used, but in lesser capacity now due to the unstable, I guess, the market around Bitcoins and XMR, etc. Ransomware is the flavor of the day. And actually, I already spoke in pretty good positions on the next cybercrime frontier, actually diving deeper into those attack vectors. But the understanding around the cybercrime trends is that those groups are essentially focused on identifying the most lucrative targets within their networks. And those are the ones that are used to essentially target and used in kind of a more human exploitation approach, but also they sell some of those infections or auction, or they work closely with the groups. And this is kind of like the cybercrime model developed predominantly, or rather evolved in the European or Eastern European world. And of course, we cannot talk before about anything related to major groups, operations, botnets, specifically in crime world, without mentioning Slavic, because he's the godfather, in some shape or form of the cybercrime itself. He developed the scalable models and solutions, including the peer-to-peer Zeus, and built the business club. He became a business person in the world of the crime, and he's the one who developed the business club, which was used to both cash out and do fraud directly through the peer-to-peer Zeus, but also he deployed the first ransomware, or rather they commercialized the ransomware CryptoLocker. And one of the interesting aspects that they also kind of tries to pursue more corporate targets. And he's the one that also laid the foundations of the cybercrime world and cybercrime actors as came along with him or after him, because they all in both of the cases we've seen the Dridex and TrickBot groups that we were just talking about here. They are former customers of the Slavic operations, and he's the one that at the forefront of everything and in the beginner of the root of all evil, if so to speak. And the idea is, like, once again, just to solidify, is the hunting for high-value targets. And that's where the most of the tooling, as I mentioned earlier, arise from. One of the most active ways and some of the active attack chains from the offensive to defensive side, from the crime offensive side, as I mentioned earlier, to really be ahead of the criminals, you need to think like them. You need to be like them in many shape or forms, but without committing crimes, and learning and studying behaviors. And what they do is that it's kind of a typical attack chain where you can now Conti ransomware, where you can be supplanted or replaced by Conti ransomware by the same chain of group of actors. But usually Emotet, for example, it's a malware used as a loader. Then they deploy a TrickBot banking malware to steal banking credentials or improve their visibility into the machines. And then, of course, ransomware. And the way they identify which machines will be deployed, just take into account that they have thousands of infections all over the world. What one unique idea can bring them closer to the most high-value targets, the most money they can make, the most time they can save on their own. So they would not waste their time dealing with small accounts and focused on big valuable targets. Is that the machines that respond back, they can ask machines, hey, return back the net view of all the networks. And by the net view records, parsed and Active Directory responses, they can identify, oh, those are machines that are more interesting for us to pursue from the human exploitation side. And they will deploy essentially, as I mentioned here, the PowerShell Empire is one of the flavor of the day, is in Cobalt Strike. Those are the common, of course, open, rather offensive tools used, penetration testing tools used by the Crimeware groups. So from the defensive side, thinking about what they operate, it's also kind of, they can look like penetration testers in your networks, but in fact, they are just simply cybercriminal groups are using the cybercrime precursors, the normal like genes of Emotet and TrickBot, and then also jumping into the penetration testing kits. And the way they bridge those gaps is the network and Active Directory parsing. Pretty interesting idea, and it actually works for them phenomenally. Another aspect, and this is kind of to show you what are unique aspects and how it works, of course, from their side. Actually, this is the intercepted operations of the actual groups behind. As we mentioned earlier, this is them, of course, looking into Interpreter and the Armitage view and the beacon, of course, as you can see in the bottom. And that's them parsing the networks, looking for unique, high valuable targets, etc. But this is the unique aspects of the operation. So they essentially hired a staffed folks who, or rather operators who are skilled in exploitations. Pretty interesting idea. And it's actually, this is the future and current state of the malware landscape. And again, one of the interesting aspects of the talk is that how profitable it can be. And in one case, the Cloud Jumper, which is a very common MSP provider in the United States. That's where I'm from. So they essentially extorted their customer base in $5 billion in total, 5% of their whole customer base, to be paid in Bitcoins. So it's in cryptocurrency. It's super profitable, super successful. I call it like the ransomware in the cloud. And this is kind of like, that's what they've been doing. They've been looking for directories and companies with huge networks, companies that also are MSP providers, and also companies that have interconnected access to large environments. And this is the flavor of the day, and also we'll dive deeper into what the unique aspects and how they work with the Lazarus or the North Korean groups. As we established earlier, is that there's the crime trends are focused on parsing high-value targets via network records. They're also interested in big corporate networks to reach with point-of-sale terminals, reach with Swift, for example, gateways, reach with different other ATM, automated teller machine network setups and environments. So they're the most profitable for them. But the way they monetize the breaches or the accesses, the groups, the intersections from the hacker mindset is that this is access as a commodity. So they oftentimes, hey, we get access, like for example, they get access to major US financial institutions. And they will say to another actor, hey, we get access to one major financial institutions. They can try to sell access through the dark web, of course, the forums like Exploit and many others. Or they can also try to sell it once or access as a service, or work in a profit sharing model, or they can offer an actor, hey, we give you free access to any bots of your choice, but you'll just pay us a percentage of the engagement, which is probably one of the more interesting aspects of work for many sophisticated groups, because they prefer stable access, and they'll just pay a percentage fee, especially in the beginning. It's a lucrative model. And we believe that access as a service is the model used by TrickBot and Lazarus Group based on the evidence we obtained. So the angle. So there was APT approach and there was ransomware, of course. Angles that we discussed earlier is that the TrickBot itself has been a pretty phenomenal malware on its own. It has been brought back to life in 2016, but it had roots in the YARA banking malware, YARA Group, or YARA Operations. YARA was basically former customers of the person I mentioned earlier, Slavic, Evgeny Mikhailovich Bogachev, who's currently on the FBI Cyber Most Wanted list, and there's a $3 million award. So if you ever find him somewhere, we know that he likes his boat, and we know that he likes boating in the Black Sea. So you can gain $3 million from the FBI and the U.S. Department of Justice, but he's still out. And he was the one that offered. Actually, he was the mastermind of the group that the YARA was born into. So the YARA was another banking malware group that became, of course, disappeared after the supposed Russian law enforcement takedown in 2015, 2016, and then came back as TrickBot. And the facets of TrickBot and the way it works, as you see, it does the banking fraud aspects operations, where they do direct account takeovers, especially focused on those accounts and those banks that do have one-day transfers. Those are the most valuable ones. In the US, of course, we have Zelle system that allows the quick bank transfers. They also have money drops, of course, mule networks, and wire transfers. So they still monetize all the major banks, oftentimes pretty successfully. So that has a steady income going into their networks. Also, ransomware, of course, Ryuk and now Conti ransomware has been used by them as a group on its own. There's, of course, stealers, where they steal different aspects: financial information, personal identifiable information, network information. They steal applications, passwords from different open VPNs to RDPs to many, many other components, crypto mining. So you can see it's a very rich operations focused on financially motivated aspect. And this is the Crimeware. And the reason why we used to delineate in the world of the intelligence. We used to say there's a Crimeware. What we mean by Crimeware, it's the financially motivated. And then there's an APT, or rather nation-state APT, where those groups are not interested in making money from those machines that they infect, but in fact they're looking for either for different purposes, like, for example, gaining espionage activities, which is commonly attributed to the Chinese APT groups, or, for example, of course, with the US elections, and there's Russian groups, including APT 28 and 29. The Russian groups are linked to the GRU, the special forces that are linked to the election meddling and hacking into the Democratic National Committee. So those have different targets and different goals, but this was the interesting aspect. So the Anchor mystery. The Anchor was this fork project we found that had the Anchor PDB path, which is a program database path in the malware, while we're looking for TrickBot. We're looking for the TrickBot cryptor, basically, and through the cryptor and through the analysis and through external hunting, we're able to identify there's another fork of this called Anchor. It looked like TrickBot. It had its own DNS component, different ways to communicate with the server, but it had unique features, enough unique features and the replications of the communications that would look like a TrickBot. So, and we saw it was Anchor deployed in very interesting infections, was not spread via normal TrickBot channels, and it was actually the connector between the worlds of the Crimeware and APT. And that's how we got into the North Korean attribution. As you can see here, that the world of APT, the Crimeware, it's, of course, ransomware, fraud, stealers, and network hunting module is the connector to many operations. Inject modules, password graph, for example. And then the right side is the APT domain, Advanced Persistent Threat Group domain. This is the domain where we can see the point of sale malware. Also, it's derived from the Anchor project, Anchor deinstaller. Ejection malware has a deinstallation capabilities to covertly remove its traces on the host, which is super good for many, of course, operators who want to be stealthy on those infections. Anchorbot, and also the link to PowerTangbot. So PowerTangbot is the PowerShell, of course, version, as you might be familiar with, of the Ratangbot. That's the malware that previously was found actually in Poland when the North Korean group attacked the Polish bank authority, targeting them via waterfalling attack, and it also spread into different banks. And the malware they deployed was Ratangba. The Ratangba, it's a PowerShell version, a PowerShell rebuild of the Ratangba tool. As you can see, the approach was a little bit different. They were staying in the networks longer. They were not rushing into squeezing value, as I said earlier, or looking to bank transfers. So the reconnaissance is the key. Point of sale terminals and environments are super interesting to them, and that's where the Lazarus and North Korean group is. So, and the anchor was that project mystery that we found, and that was the discovery report we actually published later on through the Sentinel Labs. What's the unique technical link that actually establishes the unique high fidelity connections? It actually has never been proven 100%, but we found direct, exact evidence of the connection between those groups. And the connections was similar, pretty simple. The TrickBot anchor server, the specific server, has a task command. As you can see, the ecom backstore was the URL. What they used with the action, and action was cgetPass, was passed through the high-profile victim infections to download and execute a Lazarus Group Ratangba. And Ratangba is actually quite a unique tool attributed exclusively to the Lazarus Group widely in information security circles. And it was the mystery that unites both the groups and explains that something interesting. So it's not really no longer we see just the kind of the regular looking Crimeware tools. We see some possible tools linked to the North Korean group, and we started to investigate it more. Just remember this ecom backstore as a domain for the execution, and that was the technical exact link between those groups that are establishing the high fidelity confidence in any assessments we have. Also where you might have seen this exact ecom backstore, one of the cases and kind of like one of the high-profile events discovered and discussed here at the conference, one of them could be the Chile Red Bank intrusions. As you remember, maybe in 2018, 2019, there was an intrusion in Chilean Red Bank. It's one of the biggest banks in Chile. Essentially, part of the intrusion was that one of the developers inside the Chilean bank was approached on LinkedIn by a possible job offer. And the job offer was another competing bank, and they essentially offered them a Skype interview in Spanish, and actually because it's in Chile. So they offered a Spanish language job interview, and actually the person went to this interview, spoke on Skype with a Spanish person, and they asked him to deploy, or rather execute an executable on the machine, basically an application. Just fill your name, fill your resumes, but this application itself contained this, I guess, unique thread procedure, thread proc, as they said. And whenever you launch this application, it's a simple .NET application developed by this Lazarus Group that had this ecom backstore command. At that time, it was simply base64 executed and downloaded through PowerShell. And that's actually, this specific command was executed on the bank network itself through that Skype, LinkedIn job interview via Lazarus. So two things came up, that Lazarus, A, have abilities or have people who can speak Spanish, and B, is they have unique ways to distribute malware directly to the bank employees as needed. And but again, remember this ecom backstore? This is the same exact ecom backstore task as we've seen. The only difference between the anchor execution of the Lazarus Group PowerShell that we know and attribute to TrickBot, and the North Korean, of course, APT Skype interview tool execution was the last action from the AGET PSB was CGET PSB, and actually all the timestamps match as well. So that's where the exactly unique link lies in. So throughout this research, came out to be very interesting, and this was the tool that was deployed. Actually, I was part of the Chilean Red Bank intrusion incident response, and I was looking into some of the work that was done actually, and the bank was able to successfully stop the attack. At that time, the North Korean group deployed specific tools known to be attributed to them on their networks and try to harvest and get access to their payment gateways. So the key for the Lazarus is the payment gateway still. So let's just briefly talk about the Lazarus on its own. So you might be familiar, as I mentioned, like Lazarus maybe like 20 different times. So Lazarus actually is a way I separate, and many in our information security community used to separate them in two different buckets. One is APT 38, which is the convention, of course, used by one of the big vendor FireEye. It's the cybercrime group, Blue North, and APT 37. It's the government group, rather, in Dario. And whenever you see the news cycles about North Korean's APT 38 hacking group behind bank heist, that's the group we're talking about. It's the branch or part of the Lazarus Group or linked to the Lazarus Group. Remember, the biggest bank heist in the world history, attempted $1 billion transfer from the Bangladesh bank heist, attributed to the same group as we were talking here. And this was 2016. In fact, they stole 81 million in the end, where they tried to transfer money from the banks into casinos by getting access to one specific engineer machine computer who had access to SWIFT gateways. They also spoofed, as you see, $1 billion of requests from Bangladesh Central Bank to Federal Reserve of New York to transfer money to accounts in the Philippines. And actually, the only reason why they got caught, or rather, there are a few reasons about how and why they got caught. They got caught because they misspelled one of the recipients' names, and also get caught because, of course, irregularities across the huge SWIFT transactions. And also, one of the unique things that, as we came out, that the Southeast Asia banking attacks also they also helped North Korea withstand economic sanctions. So North Korea operates in a very different world as we are. So they're heavily sanctioned entity by different regulators, and essentially they need to bring the money back into their government. And that's where the nexus come back. And there's look for ways to connect with the financially motivated groups, including TrickBot. And that's the group is part of. 2017, of course, it's the focus on SWIFT bank heist. And then, of course, the US sanctions and attribution DOJ report came up later, essentially blaming one specific person in North Korea who developed both the WannaCry ransomware that spread across the world, also linked him to the operations of the Bangladesh bank heist. So pretty interesting indictment. Highly recommend you reading actually in Department of Justice website, looking into specific links that attributed to that person and the actions committed. Another thing, and so this is the APT 38 cybercrime group. Another interesting links we've seen earlier that the APT 38 group also was linked to TA 505 as well through distribution chain. So they also connected to that group. We also know for a fact that another company published also a pretty interesting finding where they found additional toolkits linked to another PowerShell tools attributed to Lazarus, also part of that environment. So APT38 is pretty well connected, but not only they're well connected, they also might be in the same circles where the criminals are. And that makes them pretty unique and pretty interesting. And another group is the APT37. It's the government group. It's the Andarial group as attributed or called by other vendors in security, information security world. And as you remember, the Sony, there was a comedy. So they basically operate actually as attacks to protect the regime or protect and maybe censor censor actually in some shape or form the view on their leader of the country. So and also another interesting aspects that they also of course link to the Sony hack intrusion. That's where in the US where they stole so much data. And it also came out as Guardians of Peace. So they established a fake hacktivist persona, similarly as we've seen with the Russian state groups, use the Guccifer as a fake persona as well to essentially leak and pretend to be not the nation state group actor, but also just a hacktivist group. So pretty interesting. And they actually focus still on South Korea predominantly, and also the US, of course. So APT37 is also very, very interesting. But this is the dissection within the groups on their own related to North Korea. So going from the cybercrime link, going to showing just two intersections shows like the unique diversity of the group itself and what their interests are. Another kind of like reasonable question is like, how did they get so good, like on North Korea on its own? So North Korea has basically two internet connections. One is in China, one is in Russia. And they also have a Soviet-style training program, which is it's quite good for mathematicals and programming analysis and different technical tasks. So kids with mathematical aptitude are funneled through select middle schools. Top performers are eligible to attend either Pyongyang Kim Il-sung University or Kim Il University. And of course, the military service is the backbone of many other countries' operations, and offensive operations are also the ones that are facilitating a lot of the activity around it. And the university graduates showing promise also report to Bureau 121, which is the Reconnaissance General Bureau. Advanced training also provided in Shenyang. Also, those with special attitude are also sent to live in different countries. That's kind of a unique aspect about the Lazarus, is that we believe that there are accesses and the people linked to North Korea actually operate and live around shell companies all over the world, and also live around embassies linked to North Korea, also all over around the world. This is kind of a pretty interesting view on why North Korea and why North Korea is so good dealing with cybercrime and getting so well connected. It's just because of that unique backbone operations, unique mindset, also kind of closer to the Soviet-style education programs. And this is what makes them quite unique across the spectrum. And what's the outlook between against North Korea 2020? Outside of even looking into the TrickBot, they've been very stealthy. The APT-38, low and slow and effective. There's of course this increased interest in cryptocurrency. That has always been the flagship operation for them, where they targeted many South Korean cryptocurrency, either trading companies or cryptocurrency regulators or entities linked to large transactions or have access to multiple interesting cryptocurrency nexus or nexi. They also have access and view to small trial campaigns for ransomware, where they play with Venus Locker in South Korea as well, which is one of the ransomware used by the group itself. We also think that they will likely maintain focus on large-scale monetary options with some of the, I guess, of course, focus on the revenue generation aspects. So they realized that Swift gateways, that's supposed to be the ways for them to transfer the most amount of currency. And actually chose a pretty clever way of doing that. How do you cash out $1 billion, the $1 billion basically? I guess it's not easy. Actually, if you look into that, it's hard for you to receive a big payment even into the new, let's say, off-shell company, because you need to have balance, you need to have a history in that account to even receive like $10 million. So it's actually pretty complex. But actually, they found a pretty good way to cash out via casinos. So casinos deal with lots of cash in hand. They also deal with a lot of currency. They're also not heavily regulated. It's always in the Philippines where the casinos were, and that's where they decided to pursue. So pretty interesting idea from the cash out perspective. Is just to cash out $1 billion via casinos, and that's what they've been looking into. The APT-37, as I mentioned earlier, remains focused on South Korea and also remains focused on the US. So some of the unique ways of the research is that these groups are still active. They're still actually increasing their activity in light of the worldwide elections. There's additional reporting coming out on that soon, but this is the current state of the groups as we know. The impact of our research and the finding itself is that if you see the guidance of the North Korean cyber threat, that's the time when the US CERT established findings saying this, that they also believe that the cyber-enabled financial fraud and money laundering are part of their operations. And we also advised the United Nations Council on basically on the sanctioning of the North Korea related to their crime operations. So the research had extremely well impact on that side. It just shows that how the hacking skills can be used to bring money back into the highly restricted and highly protected country and highly sanctioned country in the world. So if you have high hacking skills and essentially very motivated and you work for North Korean government, they would likely recruit you for bringing the money back into the currency and support the regime. because that's what their major issue is across the lines, just to support their allies and operations in North Korea. And that's where the impact of our research came with. So one of the unique things, I guess, that comes out of that, kind of the idea is, and we'll just show you a quick, pretty cool tip. Like I want you to show, like, you know, especially if you're working as a defender or attacker, I want you to think about this as a moving way forward. Is like, if you play a chess with your enemy, you need to take decisions faster as they are already in. Assume that their attack already happened, of course. Assume that the worst scenario already occurred. This mindset allows you to take certain actions that you wouldn't otherwise, but also allows you to see like additional opportunities. Another idea I always say, and I mentioned, that's something that you should be thinking of. Think like them. Just try to study them as they study us, right? So think about the cybercrime mindset. Think about how they think. Try to be, just in order to be ahead of them, you need to think like them. That's what the mindset and also the spirit of the conference itself we want you to walk away with. So the future is, of course, one of the unique things I want you to recommend and just like walk away with is that I'll show you one unique tool, an example how we caught some of the earlier samples related to the Anchor bot, and also found the nexus between the Crimeware groups in North Korea. And then, of course, linking the defensive searches and hunting in the network environments to the offensive operations, where we found a server that had a specific command, and we pulled that command essentially. But the YARA Hunting is actually the tool. Of course, if you might be familiar with YARA, it's a Swiss Army knife, basically a very complex. I don't want to reduce it to the regular expression, but it's kind of like works as a pretty good search engine rather, search language written in Ruby, essentially used to write Aristotle signatures or many other signatures. Many tools actually rely on YARA signatures for the operations and antivirus engines. Think of YARA as a static engine of many antivirus companies and antivirus engines. So the malware developers work just legitimate operators, so legitimate software developers. They want to automate repetitive tasks. So they don't want to rewrite the same routine twice, especially if it's something complex. They also they want to reuse as much code they already did before. So especially, for example, the crypto routines, as nobody wants to copy or redo or rewrite MD5 routine, for example, without, of course, external dependencies. So there's lots of code you carry with you as a malware or as a regular software developer. Think of them as actually a regular software developers. So as the regular software developers, their most complex issues are the external dependencies. And their external dependencies are their crypto routines, cryptographical routines. So sometimes the malware, of course, has ways to protect them from being analyzed. So to protect against analysis, they also use various algorithms, including the most popular RC4, APLib, RSA, etc., AES. So TrickBot is the one that also using a very common ways to protect it. Oftentimes they rely on things like packers and cryptors to essentially to hide the true binary, and in fact only the last stage in memory at the last second bypassing antivirus detection. So from the malware hunting perspective and from defender side, they're knowing and studying what they do. Again, thinking like them. Also to create a search rules, of course, to detect this kind of code reuse. But the key aspects about the code reuse and make long-standing and long-living YARA signatures is that focusing on the cryptographical aspects. Let's hunt for the crypto routines. That's I want to show you. And one of the unique ways is, and we'll talk quite a bit, is that the TrickBot has their own crypto server for some time, and it's been frequently updated. And one of the unique binary analysis you can do is just looking for the unique or common cryptors across the malware samples. And what the kind of crypto services are actually help us to attribute certain operations of the groups. So one of the latest version utilized the RC4, which is the symmetric algorithm with a twist. And also kind of like a perfect example when we wrote actually a full decryptor of TrickBot crypto sample. So one of the interesting and perfect examples to show you how you can use specific technical skills for good and for both for defensive and offensive purposes, studying and learning the habits of the adversary and applying them in YARA crypto routines. And the example was that the SBox. So what they did essentially with the RC4, they copy pasted the same RC4 routine into all the malware samples, but they added a null terminator in the key size, and also they added a different SBox size. And knowing two unique things, the SBox size, the unique null terminator, and the specific snippets related to, they use also a very, I call this crypto a virtual alloc x numa, which basically the name that they use one specific API import. They rely from the Windows side, which just makes them quite uniquely attributed to the group. And in the quick YARA signatures, you can see the language of YARA, the meta and strings, simple but reliable. And that's it, simple itself, and the concept used for hunting for anchor bots and connections. So once we identified the anchor bot, we were looking to the server, and server led to the not Lazarus connection. But this is a pretty clever way for you tracing. Instead of focusing just on strings within the malware, focus on cryptographical algorithms and focus on the routines that are detailing and kind of delving into the cryptographical implementations within the malware, because that's where the unique aspects is. Very rarely even Crimeware operators understand, or malware operators understand the crypto very well. Oftentimes they just copy paste from different places, including GitHub and many others. So you can always attribute to that. And what are some of the interesting key takeaways and outlook I want you to walk away with? Then of course that we've seen and continue to see is the automations of malware. What I mean by that is the crime groups created ways to automate the malware distributions, including spam bots and of course email spam plus interactive human exploitations. So what they do is they hire people with skills to run various frameworks, including, actually they even exclusively now rely on various open or penetration testing toolkits, such as Cobalt Strike, Interpreter, and some other frameworks related to, and of course PowerShell Empire, related to the pen testing tools. That's kind of the convergence of APT and Crimeware from the operations side. So the precursor of that is the malware operations, and then there you see the penetration testing kits, which is pretty much the view of the intrusions and the deep dive into some of the intrusion reports we've seen earlier. Also APT and HST groups also tap into Crimeware groups. There's an interesting research nexus we found, of course, through the we were the first ever who found that nexus between the TrickBot, Anchor, and the Lazarus, and it was through technical evidence. So the most high fidelity evidence we can ever obtain that provides high confidence assessment. So it's no longer a guess game, or it's no longer confidence, but it's almost a certainty that they are linked through some operation or some operator. We know that North Korea seeks ways to bring currency via crime groups. Pretty interesting way of thinking. Pretty interesting way to employ hacking groups to essentially to sponsor their regime. Interesting ways of thinking, but also instead of them seeking their own infections, they're also relying on some of the more interesting or some of the more established Crimeware groups such as TrickBot and Anchor. Those are the ones that operate predominantly in Russia, and those are the ones that they have connection with. And then, of course, it has some major implications for national security and threats. Whenever you do incident response work, it's no longer enough just to dismiss certain infections as simply TrickBot or simply Emotet. Oftentimes, they can lead to certain infections. Look at the profile of the company targeted, see what the network parsing records would tell the actors about this company, and that would be the way for us to be ahead of them. The hunting approach for threats and proactively and of course by studying attacker behavior is that YARA hunting rules for cryptographical implementations. And this was probably one of the most effective hunting approaches I've seen and used across many other samples and work I've done across the tracking malware threats and future cybercrime. But the view of us is in the future is that by tracing and understanding that the threats are no longer not only not geographical, but also they are connected via targeting through different groups, through different channels, and also known ways to protect, of course, YARA signatures and known ways ahead of the threat would be the key forward. And those are some of the key takeaways I want you to walk away with the conference, especially with, as I mentioned earlier, the theme of the conference is very close to my mind. It's the convergence also of the offensive and defensive skills, because I think this is also a necessary component going forward. I believe that to be a great malware reverse engineer, you have to be a great malware developer. And to be a great, again, to be a great defender, you have to be a great hacker, and also play with two hats all the time and essentially provide a good line of feedback between those hats. And it's almost like a left and right brain. They should think together and should be connected in order for you to be highly successful at what you do. And this is the future. I also want to thank some of the researcher credit and Sentinel Labs, Joshua Platt and Jason Reeves, also, who are part of my team, who were part of my team looking into this threat, who we work quite closely. So thank you to them. And I want to contribute. And at this time, I would like to thank you for being with me. Thank you for listening to my talk. And feel free to follow me on Twitter at VKIntel, and feel free to ask me any questions and send me a personal message. And thank you, and looking forward to hear what's next.